The scenes you are about to witness depict actual shipyard employment accidents resulting in death. All references to the actual accidents have been removed to protect identities and accident location. Please be advised that the depictions may be disturbing and deal with graphic subject matter. Two men were unloading steel beams from a trailer using a truck-mounted crane. The outriggers on the crane were fully extended and set. The rigger and his helper walked with each load, controlling it with tag lines. The crane operator lifted each load and swung the crane to his right about 180 degrees and lowered the beams to the ground. During the unloading, the foreman approached to talk with the rigger's helper. When the unloading was finished, the crane operator began to put away the rigging and stow the crane. The foreman left, but the rigger's helper remained standing beside the outrigger. As the operator swung the crane into the stowed position, the rigger's helper was crushed between the crane cab and the outrigger he was leaning against. The swing radius of the crane was not barricaded to prevent employees from entering a hazardous zone. The crane operator should have kept visual contact with his helpers at all times. A 45-ton hydraulic telescoping crane was being used to move several loads, weighing more than 2 tons each. The crane has a multi-part main line and a single-part auxiliary line. The crane operator had experience operating other cranes, but had no training on this specific model crane. Before beginning, he asked other crane operators how certain controls worked. He did not understand their instructions. He practiced raising and lowering the main hook and extended and retracted the boom for 15 minutes. During this time, alarms were ringing in the cab that the crane operator did not understand. He was eventually able to shut them off along with the anti-two-block system on the computer. A rigger was positioned near the first load to connect the crane's hook. He was inexperienced and undergoing his second day of training. The crane operator extended the boom to put the hook over the load. The lengthened boom put the auxiliary hook and line in a two-blocked condition. As the boom extended, the auxiliary line came under increased tension. The rigger noticed a cotter pin fly off. He looked up, saw the boom wiggle, and turned to run. The rigger was struck and killed instantly by the falling auxiliary hook. The crane operator used equipment that he was not trained to operate. Safety and warning devices were turned off or disabled during operations. Personnel must never work under the boom, hook, or loads. Two night shift employees were moving lighting and spray painting equipment inside a barge to continue a painting operation. Employees on the previous shift had been painting in the confined space continually for 10 hours. The paint mixture being used was flammable. The lighting equipment was not explosion-proof. There was no ventilation and only one open access hole. Painters and laborers constantly entered the confined space without any air monitoring. As the two night shift employees set up the equipment, a spark ignited the flammable paint vapors and caused a flash fire. Both employees were killed. Sufficient ventilation must be maintained to keep the concentration of flammable vapors below 10% of the lower explosive limit. A shipyard competent person must visually inspect and test the confined space for oxygen content and lower explosive limits prior to entry by employees. Explosion-proof lighting and equipment must be used. The employer did not make sure that employees entering confined spaces were properly trained to recognize hazards. Employees were cleaning a confined space on board a vessel using solvents. The foreman told them to ventilate the space and dilute any vapors with an air hose. A first shift worker brought in an oxygen hose to ventilate the space. The oxygen flowed into the compartment for 3 hours. A second shift worker entered the confined space smoking a cigarette. He threw the cigarette to the deck, and it began to burn like a candle. When he stepped on the cigarette, his shoe and pant leg caught fire. The fire, fed by the oxygen-rich air, burned hot, and he was quickly engulfed in flames. He died as a result of the burns he received. Oxygen was used to ventilate the confined space instead of fresh air. The confined space was not inspected and tested for air quality and flammability by a shipyard competent person prior to entry. The employee was smoking in an area where smoking was prohibited. Employees should only smoke in designated areas. A welder and his helper were installing guardrails on a dock. The work was being done from a smaller barge that was tied to the dock. The smaller barge was moved along the dock as work progressed. The helper would hold a section of guardrail in place while the welder would tack weld it. The welder would come back later and finish the weld. The icy deck made walking and working surfaces very slippery. While the welder was finishing several sections, his helper reached around the corner of the dock to take a measurement. He slipped and fell into the water. The welder heard his helper's call and ran to him. The welder could not reach him and ran to call for help. When the welder returned, his helper had disappeared beneath the water. There were no training programs in place to prevent falling accidents. An assessment of the work hazards should have been conducted prior to starting work. Not enough attention was given to the icy working surface conditions. There were no handrails installed around the work barge. There were no life rings available to rescue the drowning employee. The helper should have been wearing a body harness and a lanyard tied off to a secure structure. A welder was erecting scaffolding inside a vessel that was under construction. The welder attached the scaffolding to the bulkhead using bracket clips that are temporarily tack welded in place. The welder was trained and certified to install and weld these type of clips. After he finished assembling the scaffold structure with temporary welds, the welder walked out onto the scaffold boards. One of the bracket clips failed, causing him to fall 18 feet to the deck below. He died from massive injuries. The bracket clips were only tack welded. The welder should not have climbed onto the scaffolding with tack welded clips. Welds should be inspected before a scaffolding structure is placed into use. The welder was wearing a full body harness, but did not tie off. A mechanic needed a workbench-mounted grinder and went to the tool room to get one. None were available. He decided to construct a grinder by modifying an electric buffing wheel. He created a mount and attached the buffing motor to the bench. He removed the buffing wheel, installed a grinding wheel in its place, and began constructing a guard. Before the guard was finished, he decided to test the grinder. He plugged it in and turned it on. As the wheel gained speed, it reached a point where the centrifugal force caused the wheel to break apart. The wheel shattered into pieces, striking the mechanic with tremendous force. The mechanic died from multiple wounds to the chest and abdomen. Equipment must never be modified for use other than its intended purpose. An operator should stand to one side when starting any grinder. A grinder must never be operated without a guard. A welder was tasked to repair a hole in the hull of a barge. Assisted by two other employees, he opened the hatch into the compartment where the repair was to be made. A welding machine was positioned on deck near the hatch. Carrying the welding leads, the welder climbed down to the repair site. The compartment was flooded with 5 inches of water, so he quickly became wet. He inserted a welding rod into the electrode holder. He waded back through the compartment and climbed up to the deck. He turned on the welding machine and went below to repair the hole. He burned the first rod and dropped the stub into the water. He picked up a new welding rod, and as he inserted it into the electrode holder, he completed the circuit between the electrode holder and ground. Current flowed through his saturated glove, through his wet body, out his submerged steel-toed shoes, and into the steel deck he was standing on. The location of the victim inside the barge made rescue difficult. Because no rescue equipment was available at the job site, the fire department was called. Upon arrival, they found that the victim was beyond resuscitation. The welder must wear appropriate protective clothing, such as rubber boots and gloves that insulate him from electric current. The welder was not properly trained to perform welding operations in wet environments. We urge you to think about the program you just saw and to use that information to make your job safer. Don't add your name to the list of fatalities. If you are asked to perform a task that you believe is unsafe, are asked to do it in an unsafe manner, or against OSHA regulations, ask your supervisor or employer for help in determining the correct way to proceed. You can also contact your OSHA consultation representative for help or visit the OSHA website at www.osha.gov. If you have an emergency or need to report a fatality or imminent life-threatening situation, or need to file a complaint, please contact our toll-free number, 1-800-321-OSHA.